Hey, welcome back, everybody. We are delving into topic 8.2, human impacts on ecosystems, which means we're actually nearing the end of the year at this point, right? Because we've actually already done most of Unit 9. To accompany this lecture, please, please, please take the time to crack open that Miller textbook, chapter 17. And for the information we'll go through here, why don't you focus on pages 540 through 551? That should be some good background info for you. All right, couple of reminders before we move on. We've talked about this range of tolerance in previous units, but I just want to bring this back up because we are talking about aquatic and terrestrial pollution in this unit. And we have to remember that all organisms have a range of tolerance for various factors, and one of those factors could be the amounts of a particular pollutant in the water, right? And in some cases, there can be some presence of a pollutant without causing any major stress, okay? But we are talking about issues when we get to that zone of stress or a zone of intolerance for some of our things, right? So not a bad idea to remember this zone, and then our generalist specialist species, right? Often our specialist species, excuse me, often have a more narrow zone of tolerance for a lot of factors, not necessarily pollutants though. All right. Also want to remind you guys that we are focused on a systems approach to environmental science in this class, which is understanding that each of our ecosystems is a group of interworking parts that interact and function as a whole. And if we alter one part of that system, that can have impacts on the rest of the system, in sometimes unforeseen ways. So, for example, coral reefs, as we know, are a super duper important ecosystem, right? And we know that they're threatened because of increasing temperatures of the ocean, increasing acidity of the ocean, things like sediment pollution and destructive fishing practices, right? So these are human impacts that are causing a rapid decline in our coral species, right? And if we lose corals, all the organisms that rely on coral or have an intimate relationship with coral will also be affected. Okay, so remember that zone of tolerance or the range of tolerance for different organisms, kind of how to interpret that. Also, remember we are approaching things as a systems approach. So even though it may seem like one tiny little part of the system might get altered, that can have impacts that ripple outward to all kinds of things that we might not be immediately apparent. All right, let's move in. Let's talk a little bit about oil spills. All right, we didn't bring this up back in Unit 6 when we talked about energy, particularly fossil fuels. But oil spills, as the name implies, are when we have either a oil transporter, like a tanker, right, runs aground and spills oil into water, or perhaps an offshore oil platform has an accident, and the water that it might have been pumping up through several thousand feet of water might then, or the oil that it was pumping up might then begin leaking into the ocean at that point. All right. Um, so before we delve into some specific examples like the Exxon Valdez and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, let's talk a little bit about like what an oil spill does to the ecosystems. How are ecosystems impacted? Well, for one, the oil itself, crude oil, is toxic to marine life, so it's directly toxic. Two, right? Um, for like uh, mammals and birds, right? There's a really thick tar-like coating they can get on the birds, so making it impossible for them to fly. And that oil does not wash off. So if you guys have ever gotten oil on your hands, for example, you try to just wash it off with plain old water. Water is not very effective. You need some sort of dispersant or surfactant like soap, for example, to help pull that away. Well, there's not an abundance of soap out in the ocean. So these organisms that get coated with the heavy, thick tar-like oil are essentially stuck like that and eventually die. All right. Now, if you're on the bottom, you might have been thinking you're safe, right? Oil floats on water. Well, some of the components actually sink to the bottom and can cover those bottom-dwelling organisms. They're not safe there either, right? And then, of course, when there's a big oil spill, right, that has huge economic impacts for fishing and tourism. All right, so let's talk about some important incidents or notable incidents that have occurred in the U.S. in and around oil spills. And this first one occurred in 1989 when I was a wee lad. right? The Exxon Valdez tanker ran aground in the Prince William Sound, right? Ended up dumping about 11 million gallons of crude oil into the very pristine wilderness, the Prince William Sound, right? As it turns out in this case, the captain of the ship passed off the steering to an unlicensed third mate. Captain of the ship thought it'd be a good idea to go have some drinks while he passed off the steering wheel to somebody who wasn't qualified to do it. He got in a lot of trouble. They ended up paying all kinds of money, something in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 billion in cleanup and restitution to people who lost uh, their uh, living, their career in fishing and stuff like that in the Prince William Sound, right? But something like 1,300 miles of shoreline were affected. They think that it is responsible for about 250,000 seabird deaths, 3,000 otter deaths, 300 seals, 250 bald eagles, and 22 killer whales or orcas. Yikes. All right. Now, fast forward about 20 years ish, right? And we have the April 20th, 2010 Deepwater Horizon accident. So this is actually when I first started teaching AP Environmental Science. My very first year, I believe, was when this occurred. All right. So what happened here is a faulty blowout prevention valve. So some of the safety measures that they put in place on these offshore oil rig platforms were faulty, and there was basically a natural gas plume that worked its way up to the surface, ignited, caused an explosion. That's what you're seeing in that picture right there. Killed something like 11 people. All right. Now, aside from just the accident itself, because the oil platform essentially disintegrated after the explosion and fire, right? The oil that it had tapped into deep beneath the oceans, thousands of feet below the surface, just started gushing from the bottom of the ocean directly into the Gulf of Mexico. So sometimes this is actually called the Gulf of Mexico oil spill. All right. Uh, the trouble with this one is they couldn't get it to stop. Right. It was thousands of feet beneath the surface. Really, really difficult to get down there and set something up so that they could plug essentially the giant hole that was gushing at some point, they think up to 65,000 gallons of oil per day into the water. And this went on for months until they were finally able to get that hole plugged. All right. Now, you might be curious as to how we go about cleaning that up. So we have millions and millions of gallons, right, of this crude, sticky liquid out there in nature. It gets on the rocks and the beach, stuck in the sand, all over the seabirds and so on. How do we go about cleaning this up? Well, we are going to watch a little video in class, right? But here is the URL in case you missed that. But spoiler alert, it's really hard. All right, so let's move on to a little bit about litter and plastic pollution. We'll talk a little bit about more about this in class as well. But aside from just being unsightly, like litter can cause all kinds of problems, especially when it's the plastic type, because the plastic type does not biodegrade in any sort of reasonable amount of time. And it can work its way into the ocean and cause intestinal blockage. So what you're seeing here is a bird, right, that had died and began to decompose, and you can see the plastic that bird had ingested, which was the likely cause of death. All right, and here you can see the plastic six-pack ring got around this turtle when it was much smaller, having kind of some drastic impacts on its growth and development over time. All right. So plastic, by the way, is a great tool if you want something that is durable and last for a long time because it is both those things. It's very durable, it lasts a long time, it's pretty darn stable. It makes it great for things that you want to keep around and use for long periods of time. All right. Not originally intended to be a single-use throwaway type of thing. And they're finding that plastic pollution is exceptionally problematic, particularly when it gets into really small pieces out in the ocean. Like I said, we'll chat about that a little more during class. All right, sediment pollution, right? So we're talking about when um, we have a normally clear body of water, right? Good light penetration, so low sediment in the water, right? But then maybe after a big rainstorm, for example, lots of those sediments wash into a waterway, right? Well, those sediments, if they get suspended for long periods of time, can disrupt photosynthesis, right? Killing off our aquatic plants, right? Can bury potential shelters under sediment. Aquatic organisms attached to rocks can sometimes get removed by sediment as it's washed along. It does cause all kinds of little problems, and mainly it's when we get excessive amounts of suspended particles, so things like sand or clay or silt, right? But typically we get an abundance of those when we get a heavy rain. Uh, Near areas where, let's say, it's been cleared of vegetation. So, like a farm field, for example, that doesn't currently have any plants growing on it. That's really prone to erosion and we're putting sediments into waterway. After clear cutting, for example, right? In and around lands that have been overgrazed, strip mines, construction, etc. All right. But yeah, it limits light penetration, right? Can cover aquatic animals and plants. And sometimes, we might have certain toxins that are not water soluble, so don't really cause a problem in our aquatic ecosystems because they don't dissolve in water. But the sediment themselves can kind of be a mechanism to carry those toxic materials into the water and suspend them there, even though they're not technically dissolved. All right. Now, heavy metals. Okay. When you hear heavy metal, right, we got to make sure that in our context, we're not talking about the awesome kind of heavy metal, right? That's trying to stick it to their man with awesome music. We're talking about this kind of heavy metal, right? The types like arsenic and lead, cadmium, and mercury, right? These party poopers right here come mainly from like industry, mining, and fossil fuels, coal burning specifically, right? They cause problems because when they get into systems, they have a tendency to do what's called bioaccumulation, which we have talked about previously. We will bring it up again in this unit. All right. And when it gets up to certain levels within organisms, it can cause like neurological damage, developmental delays. All right. And probably they're most problematic directly to humans when they get in our drinking water. All right. Mercury specifically, uh, it gets converted by bacteria into what's called methylmercury, right? And they used to use methylmercury actually as a grain preservative. They would feed the grain that's been treated with methylmercury to like cows, for example. So people were getting methylmercury poisoning by eating the cows that ate the grain that had the methylmercury, because again, it has that bioaccumulation and biomagnification property to it. Okay. Now, I will leave you with this final thought. Okay. Mercury is a heavy metal. Okay. Freddie Mercury sang heavy metal. Is that just a coincidence? I'll let you decide.